where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You know what nobody tells you about family? Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who bleed you dry. We're fed this beautiful lie from childhood. Family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. Your relatives will always have your back. But what happens when your own aunt treats you worse than a stranger? What do you do when the people who should protect you are the ones destroying you? Here's the uncomfortable truth that'll make some of you squirm. Being related to someone doesn't obligate you to endure their cruelty. And sometimes, the greatest act of love you can perform for yourself is walking away from family that treats you like garbage. Controversial? Absolutely. True? You're about to find out. Let me ask you something brutally honest. Have you ever been invisible in a room full of people who should see you? Have you ever worked your fingers to the bone while others took credit and relaxed? Have you ever smiled through humiliation because survival required it? If you're nodding right now, this story isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror. Eleanor's tale is about to reveal something most people spend their entire lives missing. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, and the people who can't see your value are telling you everything about themselves and nothing about you. But here's the secret that'll change everything. Sometimes you need just one person to see you clearly, for you to finally see yourself. What if I told you that the worst thing that ever happened to you might be preparing you for the best thing that's coming? Sounds like cheap inspiration, right? Like something stitched on a pillow at a discount store. But stick with me, because Eleanor's story is going to shatter that cynicism. This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending abuse makes you stronger. It's about something far more nuanced and powerful. How the very circumstances designed to break you can forge you into someone unbreakable. Eleanor spent years being treated as less than nothing by the woman who should have loved her most. Years of humiliation, silence, and servitude. And then, in one evening, everything changed. Not because she transformed herself, but because someone finally had the wisdom to see what had been there all along. Here's what's going to happen in the next several minutes. You're going to witness a journey that'll make you question everything you think you know about worth, family, revenge, and justice. You'll discover why the quietest people are often the strongest, why being seen matters more than being admired, and why the best revenge isn't revenge at all. This isn't some fairy tale where a prince saves a damsel. It's far more interesting than that. It's about a woman who survived systematic dehumanization, who maintained her dignity when others tried to strip it away, who built strength in silence while everyone was too blind to notice. And when recognition finally came, it didn't come from changing who she was. It came from someone recognizing who she'd always been. Ready to uncover the mystery of how one woman went from forbidden outcast to chosen duchess? Let's dive in. You know, there's something deeply unsettling about being invisible in your own family. Picture this: a young woman named Eleanor waking up before dawn breaks, her hands already reaching for the broom before her eyes are fully open. She wasn't hired as a servant. She was born into this family, yet somehow she'd become less than the help. It's a peculiar kind of cruelty, isn't it? The kind that doesn't announce itself with dramatic confrontations, but seeps into every mundane moment, like water through a crack. Her aunt, Lady Margaret, her own blood, had perfected this art of diminishment, turning family gatherings into public performances of humiliation. Every meal Eleanor served, every floor she scrubbed, every whisper behind her back was a reminder. You're here, but you don't belong. The mornings were the worst, I'd imagine. While her cousins, Beatrice and Constance, slept in silk sheets, dreaming whatever dreams privileged girls dream, Eleanor would already be in the kitchen preparing their breakfast. There's this universal experience, right? Being the person who always gets the leftovers at family dinners, the one whose achievements are footnotes while everyone else's are headlines. She lived that every single day. Lady Margaret would parade her own daughters like prized possessions, their elaborate gowns, their refined education, their carefully curated social graces. Meanwhile, Eleanor wore hand-me-downs that didn't quite fit, her education limited to whatever she could overhear through closed doors. It's maddening how some people treat family worse than strangers, creating hierarchies where love should exist. The public humiliations cut deepest, though. Imagine serving champagne at a party where you should have been a guest. Eleanor would glide through crowded salons carrying silver trays, her presence acknowledged only when someone needed their glass refilled. The whispers would follow her, like ghosts. "That's the poor relation," they'd say, voices dripping with pity that felt more like contempt. Beatrice and Constance would laugh with their friends, occasionally glancing her way with looks that said everything. "You're beneath us." There's something particularly devastating about being treated as furniture in spaces where you should matter. She became a silence in her own story, a trace of what family should mean, but never quite measuring up in their eyes. But here's what fascinated me about her situation. It wasn't just about physical labor. Anyone can sweep floors or prepare meals. No, the real work they demanded from Eleanor was emotional. She had to smile through the slights, remain grateful for the generosity of having a roof over her head, never complain about the hidden injustices that governed her days. Lady Margaret had created this elaborate code of behavior, where speaking up meant being ungrateful, where showing pain meant being dramatic. It's psychological warfare dressed up as family dynamics. You've probably seen it yourself, maybe in your own life, maybe in someone else's. That person at every gathering who does all the work while everyone else takes credit, who absorbs all the criticism while others bask in praise. Lady Margaret had created this elaborate code of behavior where speaking up meant being ungrateful, where showing pain meant being dramatic. It's psychological warfare dressed up as family dynamics. The conflict within Eleanor must have been tremendous. How do you reconcile loving people who treat you like you're forbidden from their inner circle? She'd watch Beatrice and Constance receive gifts, attention, opportunities, all the things she was systematically denied. They'd complain about trivial inconveniences while she worked her fingers raw just to earn a corner to sleep in. There's this particular brand of exhaustion that comes from being perpetually undervalued, and Eleanor lived it daily. Yet somehow, and this is the enigma we're going to unravel, she didn't break. Most people would have crumbled under that weight, would have either exploded in rage or imploded in despair. But she held something inside, some secret reserve of strength that even she probably didn't fully understand yet. The worst part? Lady Margaret wasn't some cartoon villain twirling a mustache. She probably justified everything with twisted logic. I'm teaching her humility. Or, she should be grateful I took her in. That's how cruelty often works. It disguises itself as virtue, wraps itself in righteousness. Margaret would attend church on Sundays, donate to charities, maintain her reputation as a respectable woman of society. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, she was systematically erasing Eleanor's sense of worth. It's a conspiracy of silence that happens in countless families. Everyone knows something's wrong, but no one speaks up because maintaining appearances matters more than protecting the vulnerable. The other relatives would see how Eleanor was treated and look away, complicit in their quietude. Now, let me paint you a specific picture so you really understand the depth of this disappearance of her dignity. During grand parties, And, Lady Margaret threw many, Eleanor would be stationed in corners, ready to serve at a moment's notice. She'd watch couples dance, hear laughter and music, see life happening around her while she existed on the periphery. Beatrice and Constance would be introduced to eligible suitors, their accomplishments rehearsed and highlighted, while Eleanor was, well, she was the help. There's something particularly cruel about proximity to joy you're not allowed to participate in. It's one thing to be lost in isolation, but quite another to be isolated in the middle of celebration. You can see it everywhere, can't you? That coworker who never gets invited to lunch, that family member who's always forgotten in photos, that friend who's only called when something's needed. But here's what Lady Margaret didn't account for, what she couldn't possibly understand in her narrow worldview. Deprivation can forge strength in unexpected ways. Every humiliation was teaching Eleanor something valuable, though the lessons came wrapped in pain. She was learning to observe, to understand human nature from a unique vantage point, invisible enough to see everything, visible enough to feel everything. Those long, thankless days were building something inside her, a mystery even she hadn't discovered yet. Margaret thought she was breaking a spirit, but she was actually tempering steel. And soon, very soon, someone would notice what everyone else had been too blind, too cruel, or too indifferent to see. So here's the question that haunted everyone who knew Eleanor's story. Why didn't she just give up? I mean, seriously, most of us would have broken under far less pressure. When you're treated like you're worthless day after day, year after year, something inside typically dies. Or at least that's what we'd expect. But Eleanor, she was different in a way that's hard to put into words. There was this silent resilience in her, like a plant that somehow finds a way to grow through a crack in concrete. You've seen those, right? Walking down a city street, and there's this tiny flower pushing through solid pavement, reaching for sunlight against all odds. That was Eleanor, surrounded by coldness and hardness, yet somehow still growing, still reaching, still alive, in ways that mattered. Let me share something personal here, because I think it'll help you understand what Eleanor was experiencing. Years ago, I found myself in a situation where everything seemed stacked against me. People doubting me, opportunities closing, my own mind becoming my worst enemy. There was this moment, this crystal-clear moment, where I had to decide. Do I let this break me, or do I find something deeper to hold on to? I discovered that real strength isn't the loud, chest-thumping kind you see in movies. It's quieter, more subtle. It's waking up when you don't want to. It's choosing dignity when you're offered none. It's believing in something better when everything around you screams otherwise. Eleanor lived in that space constantly, and nobody even noticed the secret battles she was winning every single day. Her acts of resistance were small, almost invisible, but they were everything. Late at night, when Lady Margaret and her daughters were asleep, Eleanor would sneak into the library, a room she was forbidden to enter, and read by candlelight. She'd devour books on philosophy, history, poetry, hiding each volume back in its exact place before dawn. There's something profoundly rebellious about educating yourself when others want you ignorant, about expanding your mind when they're trying to shrink your world. She'd also dream, you know? While scrubbing floors or washing dishes, she'd let her mind wander to places far beyond that suffocating household. Those dreams weren't escapism. They were survival. They were her way of keeping a part of herself that Lady Margaret couldn't touch, couldn't control, couldn't destroy. Here's what most people don't understand about resilient individuals. They're often the quietest people in the room. We've been conditioned to think strength means being loud, assertive, dominant. But that's not always true, is it? Some of the strongest people I've ever met were the ones who endured silently, who kept their dignity when everyone else was losing theirs, who maintained their humanity in dehumanizing situations. Eleanor never raised her voice, never threw tantrums, never demanded recognition. Yet every day she chose to remain herself, kind, thoughtful, observant, was an act of defiance. She refused to become bitter like Lady Margaret, cruel like Beatrice and Constance. That takes a particular kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need witnesses or applause. The enigma of Eleanor's resilience had multiple layers. Part of it was necessity. She literally had nowhere else to go, no other options for survival. But that wasn't the whole story. Plenty of people in desperate situations still break, still lose themselves completely. Eleanor had something else, something harder to define. Maybe it was hope, though not the naive kind. It was more like a deep knowing that this wasn't her entire story, that these circumstances didn't define her essence. You know that feeling when you're going through something terrible, but somewhere deep inside, you just know it's temporary? Even when you can't see the exit, you sense it exists? That's the space Eleanor inhabited, and it kept her spirit intact even as her circumstances tried to crush it. Think about the hidden conflicts she navigated daily. Every morning, she had to swallow her pride to serve people who should have been serving alongside her. Every evening, she had to witness the warmth and affection Lady Margaret showed Beatrice and Constance, the very things denied to her. There's this unique pain in watching others receive what you desperately need, especially when it's family. Most people would have become consumed by jealousy or rage, would have let those emotions poison everything inside them. But Eleanor somehow transmuted that pain into something else. She observed her cousins not with envy, but with clarity, seeing how their privilege was actually making them weaker, more dependent, less capable of real survival. She was learning lessons they'd never learn, developing strengths they'd never need, until they did. Let me give you a practical example of how this works in real life, because Eleanor's situation isn't as unique as we might think. Consider someone working 3 jobs to make ends meet while their colleagues coast on family money. Or think about the immigrant who rebuilds their entire life in a new country, while others complain about minor inconveniences. There's this forging process that happens in difficulty. You either become harder and bitter, or you become stronger and wiser. Eleanor chose the latter, though I'm not sure it even felt like a choice at the time. It was more like an instinct for survival, a refusal to let her circumstances define her character. She kept a trace of joy, even in joyless situations, maintained mystery in her own heart, even when everything felt exposed and violated. But here's the revelation that changes everything about how we understand Eleanor's story. Her strength wasn't about enduring alone. See, we often romanticize solitary struggle, but that's incomplete. Eleanor's resilience was building something, preparing her for something. Every book she read in secret was expanding her mind. Every humiliation she endured with grace was teaching her about human nature. Every moment of silence was developing her ability to observe and understand. She was becoming someone extraordinary, not despite her circumstances, but, in some twisted way, because of them. Lady Margaret thought she was creating a servant, but she was actually forging someone far more formidable. And soon, very soon, someone with the eyes to see would look at Eleanor and recognize what had been hidden in plain sight all along. A woman of remarkable depth, strength, and quiet dignity. Something had been revealed that night, something that would change Eleanor's life forever, though the real transformation hadn't even begun yet. Let me tell you about the moment everything shifted. Not gradually, but in one evening that felt like destiny had been holding its breath. Lady Margaret, always obsessed with appearances, decided to throw the grandest ball of the season at her mansion. She'd invited everyone who mattered in society, including Duke Alexander Ashford, a man whose very presence could make or break social standings. Beatrice and Constance had been preparing for weeks, their rooms overflowing with gowns and jewelry, their conversations consumed by strategies to capture his attention. Meanwhile, Eleanor? She was assigned to serve champagne and manage the kitchen staff. But here's what's fascinating about that night. It wasn't about fairy tale magic or love at first sight. It was about something far more profound, being truly seen for the first time in your life. Duke Alexander wasn't your typical nobleman obsessed with beauty and status. He'd traveled extensively, seen real hardship, lost people he loved. Life had given him this rare gift, the ability to see beyond surfaces, to recognize authenticity in a world drowning in performance. When he arrived at Lady Margaret's ball, he played his part perfectly, greeting hosts, making small talk, dancing with the expected partners. But something felt hollow about it all. You know, he'd been to countless events like this, met countless women who wanted to be duchess, and they all blurred together in their desperation to impress. Then he noticed Eleanor. Not because she was trying to be noticed. Quite the opposite. She was moving through the crowd with this quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, ensuring everything ran smoothly, essentially invisible to everyone except him. Here's where I need to share something personal to help you understand what Alexander was experiencing. I once attended a networking event. You know the type. Everyone dressed to impress, conversations feeling rehearsed and hollow. I was exhausted by the performance of it all when I noticed someone in the corner, a caterer actually, who had this genuine smile while talking to an elderly guest others had ignored. That authenticity in a sea of artifice? It was magnetic. That's similar to what Alexander felt when he observed Eleanor. While Beatrice and Constance were practically throwing themselves at him, laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm unnecessarily, competing for his attention, Eleanor was simply being. She wasn't performing, wasn't pretending, wasn't trying to be anything other than what she was, and in that moment, he saw something everyone else had missed. What exactly did Duke Alexander see that night? It wasn't about physical beauty, though Eleanor certainly wasn't lacking. It was dignity. Despite being treated as help, despite wearing a simple dress while others wore silk, despite being relegated to the shadows, she moved with this innate grace that couldn't be taught or faked. There's a specific kind of bearing that comes from surviving humiliation without losing yourself, and Alexander recognized it because he'd seen it before in people who'd endured real hardship. He watched her handle a drunk guest with quiet firmness, saw her comfort a young servant who'd broken a glass, noticed how she navigated the complex social codes of the evening without losing her composure. This wasn't someone playing a role. This was someone who'd been forged by fire and emerged intact. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Beatrice cornered him near the grand staircase, her rehearsed compliments flowing like a prepared speech. She talked about her accomplishments, her piano skills, her knowledge of French, her connections to important families. It was all surface, all performance, all designed to secure a proposal. Constance tried a different approach, playing coy and mysterious, dropping hints about her substantial dowry and social connections. Both strategies were transparent, almost desperate. Meanwhile, Eleanor passed by carrying a tray, and Alexander noticed something. When she thought no one was watching, there was this fleeting expression of sadness mixed with something else. Longing? Resignation? He couldn't quite name it, but it felt real in a room full of fakeness. That's when he made a decision that would shock everyone. including Eleanor herself. Let me break down why authenticity attracts more than performance, because this is crucial. When you're trying too hard to be impressive, people sense the effort, the calculation behind it. It creates distance rather than connection. But when you're genuinely yourself, flaws, struggles, and all, there's this magnetic quality that draws certain people in. Think about your own life. Who are you most drawn to? Probably not the people constantly bragging or posing, right? It's usually the ones who are comfortable in their own skin, who don't need validation, who remain steady regardless of circumstances. Eleanor had spent years not trying to impress anyone because she'd learned no one was paying attention anyway. That lack of performance, that absence of pretense, was precisely what made her stand out to someone capable of seeing it. Duke Alexander did something unconventional. He approached Eleanor directly while she was refilling wine glasses. "Pardon me," he said, and she turned, expecting to hear some request or complaint. Instead, he asked her name, really asked, with genuine interest. The room didn't stop or anything dramatic like that, but Lady Margaret noticed from across the hall, her face going pale. Beatrice and Constance watched in horror as their mother's servant had a conversation with the most eligible man in the room. Alexander asked Eleanor about herself, not in a condescending way, but as if her answer actually mattered. And here's the secret that Lady Margaret had been desperately trying to hide. Eleanor was intelligent, articulate, more well-read than her cousins, despite being forbidden from formal education. Those late-night reading sessions had given her depth they couldn't match. Alexander recognized it immediately, but this wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a statement. By showing interest in Eleanor, Alexander was challenging the entire social conspiracy that kept people like her invisible. He was saying, without words, that he valued substance over status, authenticity over performance, character over pedigree. Lady Margaret's carefully constructed world began cracking right there in that ballroom. The other guests started whispering, creating their own mystery about who this young woman really was. Was she actually nobility in disguise? Did she have some hidden connection? The truth was simpler and more profound. She was exactly who she appeared to be, and someone finally had the wisdom to see her value. You should have seen Lady Margaret's face the morning after the ball. It was like watching someone's entire worldview shatter in real time. Duke Alexander had done the unthinkable. He'd sent a formal letter requesting permission to call on Eleanor. Not Beatrice, not Constance, Eleanor. The very niece Margaret had spent years diminishing, hiding, treating as less than nothing. The forbidden girl suddenly had the attention of the most sought-after man in the province. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the letter, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about losing an opportunity for her daughters, it was about being exposed. If Eleanor rose in society, everyone would ask questions. Why had she been treated as a servant? What kind of aunt does that to family? The secret Margaret had carefully maintained was about to become public scandal. The shift in treatment was instantaneous and nauseating to witness. Suddenly, Margaret was all smiles and false warmth toward Eleanor. "My dear niece," she'd say, words dripping with honey that couldn't mask the poison underneath. Beatrice and Constance went from ignoring Eleanor to watching her every move with barely concealed hatred. It's remarkable, isn't it, how people who couldn't see your value suddenly become experts at recognizing it the moment someone else does? I've seen this pattern countless times. That colleague who dismissed your ideas suddenly wants to collaborate when the boss praises you. That friend who was too busy until you stopped reaching out. Eleanor was experiencing this on a nuclear level. These people who'd treated her like furniture were now scrambling to rewrite history, to pretend they'd always cared. always valued her. Here's a personal example that captures this dynamic perfectly. Years ago, I worked in a company where my contributions were consistently overlooked. My manager would barely acknowledge my presence in meetings. Then I received a job offer from a competitor. Suddenly, I was invaluable. A critical team member. Someone they couldn't afford to lose. The desperation in their backtracking was almost comical. That's exactly what Lady Margaret was doing with Eleanor. She threw a small dinner party, insisting Eleanor sit at the table instead of serving. A gesture that would have meant everything months ago, but now felt like manipulation. Margaret praised Eleanor's intelligence, her grace, her family lineage. The same woman who'd made her sleep in the servants' quarters was now calling her one of us. It was a performance for Duke Alexander's benefit, and everyone knew it, except maybe Margaret herself. But the real conflict erupted when Alexander made his intentions clear. He wanted to court Eleanor seriously, potentially marry her. That's when Lady Margaret's desperation turned into something uglier. She couldn't forbid it outright without revealing her cruelty, so she tried subtler conspiracies. She'd intercept letters, schedule family emergencies whenever Alexander planned visits, spread quiet rumors about Eleanor's uncertain heritage. Beatrice and Constance joined the effort enthusiastically. Constance suggested to society friends that Eleanor might have questionable morals, while Beatrice implied she was manipulating the Duke. It's fascinating how people who feel threatened will unite against a common enemy. The same family that had divided Eleanor from them was now unified, in trying to sabotage her chance at happiness. Why do toxic people react this way? I've thought about this a lot, and here's what I've concluded. Your success forces them to confront their own choices. When Eleanor was just a servant, Lady Margaret could justify her treatment. She was being charitable, providing shelter, teaching humility. But Eleanor becoming a duchess? That would mean Margaret had tormented someone valuable, had failed to recognize worth when it was right in front of her. It would mean she'd wasted years being cruel instead of kind, blind instead of perceptive. People like Margaret can't handle that level of self-awareness. It's easier to keep you down, to prove you never deserved better, than to admit they were wrong about you all along. Eleanor's elevation was Lady Margaret's condemnation, and Margaret knew it. The turning point came during an enigma of a conversation between Eleanor and her aunt. Margaret cornered her in the garden, dropping all pretense. "You can't actually believe he loves you," she hissed, her true face finally showing. "You're nothing, Eleanor. A charity case. He'll realize his mistake and abandon you. And you'll have nowhere to return because you've embarrassed this family." It was meant to plant seeds of doubt, to make Eleanor question Alexander's intentions, to keep her in that psychological prison Margaret had constructed. This is the vestiges of abuse talking. The voice that tells you you're not worthy, that any love or success is a fluke, that you should stay small and quiet. Margaret was trying to reinstall the codes of behavior she'd programmed into Eleanor for years. Know your place. Don't reach too high. Accept what you're given. But something had shifted in Eleanor. Maybe it started that night at the ball, or maybe it had been building all along. She looked at Lady Margaret with this calm clarity and said something I wish I could have witnessed firsthand. "Your approval was never mine to seek, and your disapproval is no longer mine to fear." Simple words, but they represented a complete revolution in her thinking. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for Margaret to validate her worth. She was stepping into the truth that Alexander had helped her see. She'd always had value, always been worthy, regardless of how others treated her. This wasn't about revenge or proving Margaret wrong. It was about liberation. Eleanor chose to accept Alexander's courtship, not to escape her circumstances, but because she genuinely wanted to explore what this connection could become. The day Eleanor accepted Duke Alexander's proposal, you could feel the seismic shift throughout the household. Lady Margaret locked herself in her chambers, Beatrice threw an actual tantrum, and Constance refused to speak to anyone. The servants, who'd always been kind to Eleanor in their quiet ways, couldn't hide their smiles. There's something deeply satisfying about witnessing justice unfold, especially when it happens naturally, rather than through revenge. Eleanor didn't have to orchestrate Margaret's downfall. Margaret had done it to herself through years of cruelty and blindness. The revelation was simple, but profound. You can't keep genuine worth hidden forever. It finds a way to surface, to be recognized, to claim its rightful place. And for Eleanor, that place was beside someone who saw her clearly, valued her deeply, and offered her a future she'd only dared dream about in silence. Now, here's where most stories get it wrong. They focus on the external transformation, the Cinderella moment with ball gowns and glass slippers. But Eleanor's real transformation, it had nothing to do with the elegant dresses Duke Alexander provided or the jewels that suddenly adorned her neck. Don't get me wrong, those things existed. She went from wearing tattered hand-me-downs to wearing the finest silks money could buy. But if you think that's what changed her, you've missed the entire point. The real shift happened somewhere deeper, somewhere far more permanent than any wardrobe could reach. It was about recovering something that had been systematically stolen from her. Her voice, her confidence, her sense of belonging in the world. Those things can't be bought or gifted. They have to be reclaimed, piece by piece, day by day. Think about a butterfly for a moment, and I know this analogy gets overused, but stick with me because there's a secret most people miss. The butterfly was always a butterfly. That caterpillar crawling on the ground already had butterfly DNA. The cocoon didn't create something new. It revealed what was always there. Eleanor's transformation worked the same way. Duke Alexander didn't create her worth, or manufacture her intelligence, or construct her dignity. He simply provided a safe space for her to remember who she'd been all along, before years of abuse had convinced her otherwise. When you've been told you're worthless long enough, you start believing it. Breaking free from that belief, that's the real metamorphosis. That's the mystery that unfolds slowly, painfully, beautifully. Let me share something from my own journey because I think it matters here. After a particularly difficult period where I'd lost almost everything, confidence, direction, sense of self, I remember the moment things started shifting. It wasn't when circumstances improved. It was when someone looked at me and said, "You know you're still you, right? All that stuff you lost was never really you anyway." That hit differently. I realized I'd been mourning the loss of things that had nothing to do with my core identity. Eleanor experienced something similar with Alexander. He'd ask her opinions on literature, politics, art, not to test her, but because he genuinely wanted to know her thoughts. For someone who'd been silenced for years, being invited to speak was revolutionary. Each conversation was her reclaiming territory Margaret had tried to conquer. The role Duke Alexander played in Eleanor's transformation is crucial to understand, because it's often misrepresented. He wasn't her savior. That narrative is tired and inaccurate. He was more like a mirror that reflected back the truth she'd forgotten. When Margaret looked at Eleanor, she saw a servant, a burden, someone to exploit. When Alexander looked at Eleanor, he saw intelligence, resilience, grace under pressure, all the things that were actually there. It's not that his perception created these qualities. His perception simply acknowledged what already existed. We all need people like that in our lives, don't we? People who see us clearly when we've lost sight of ourselves. Not people who put us on pedestals or create false versions of who we are, but people who recognize our authentic selves and reflect that truth back to us. This is where Eleanor's story diverges sharply from those superficial transformation films. You know the ones, where the ugly duckling gets a makeover, and suddenly she's worthy of love. Those stories are not only shallow, they're damaging. They suggest that external changes equal internal worth, that you need to become someone else to deserve good things. Eleanor's journey was the opposite. She didn't become someone new. She stopped pretending to be small. She didn't acquire value. She acknowledged the value she'd always possessed. The conflict wasn't about changing herself. It was about unlearning all the lies Margaret had embedded in her psyche. Every time she sat at a dinner table, as an equal instead of serving it, every time she expressed an opinion without apologizing, every time she existed without shrinking, that was healing, not transformation. Here's the practical lesson hidden in Eleanor's experience, and I want you to really hear this. You don't need to change who you are. You need to remember who you've always been, beneath the layers of other people's projections, expectations, and limitations. Think about it in your own life. How many versions of yourself have you constructed to make others comfortable? How many times have you dimmed your light because someone else couldn't handle your brightness? Eleanor had been doing that for years, making herself smaller, quieter, less than, because that's what survival required in Margaret's house. But with Alexander, she could finally stretch out, breathe fully, exist at her natural size. That's not transformation. That's liberation. That's returning home to yourself after being lost in someone else's definition of who you should be. The vestiges of her old life would occasionally resurface, though. Eleanor would sometimes hesitate before speaking her mind, old habits dying hard. She'd catch herself about to apologize for taking up space, then stop mid-sentence, realizing she didn't need to. Alexander noticed these moments and never rushed her through them. He understood that healing from years of systematic diminishment doesn't happen overnight. There's no magic wand that erases internalized oppression. It's a process, sometimes frustratingly slow, of recognizing old patterns and choosing differently. Like when Eleanor attended her first social event as Alexander's betrothed, she found herself instinctively moving toward the periphery of the room before remembering she belonged at the center now. These small revelations, these tiny acts of reclamation, were her real transformation. But perhaps the most profound shift was this. Eleanor stopped seeking external validation. For years, she'd been in this impossible position of wanting Margaret's love while knowing it would never come. That longing had created a hole inside her, a place where self-worth should have been, but wasn't. Alexander's regard began filling that space, yes, but more importantly, Eleanor herself started filling it. She began trusting her own judgment, valuing her own perspective, appreciating her own company. She'd spend afternoons reading not to secretly rebel, but because she genuinely enjoyed it. She'd express opinions not to prove her intelligence, but because she wanted to contribute to conversations. The forbidden door to her own authentic self was finally unlocked, not by Alexander's key, but by her own decision to stop accepting imprisonment. And this shift, this quiet internal revolution, would soon lead to a question everyone wondered about. What happens when the newly liberated face their former captors? So everyone expected fireworks, right? They expected Eleanor to return to Lady Margaret's estate with Duke Alexander on her arm, to publicly humiliate the woman who'd tormented her for years. Society was practically salivating for the drama. Whispers circulated about what revenge Eleanor might exact, what cruel words she'd finally unleash, what social destruction she'd orchestrate. But here's what actually happened, and it's far more powerful than any vindictive spectacle could have been. Eleanor chose peace over payback. Not because Margaret deserved mercy. She didn't. Not because the abuse wasn't real. It absolutely was. But because Eleanor understood something profound that most people miss. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so fulfilling that your oppressor becomes irrelevant. Let me be crystal clear about what this wasn't. It wasn't about being the bigger person in some performative, self-righteous way. Eleanor didn't forgive Lady Margaret in the conventional sense. She didn't excuse the abuse or pretend it hadn't shaped her, or claim everything happened for a reason. That's toxic positivity dressed up as wisdom. And Eleanor was too intelligent for that nonsense. Instead, she did something more radical. She established boundaries. Firm, non-negotiable, permanent boundaries. When Margaret sent letters requesting visits, Eleanor didn't respond. When Beatrice and Constance tried to suddenly befriend her now that she was ascending to nobility, Eleanor politely declined their invitations. She wasn't cruel about it, wasn't dramatic. She simply closed a door that had never actually been open to her anyway. There's tremendous power in that kind of quiet closure. Here's an analogy that captures this perfectly. Imagine you've been living in a house that was never yours, where you were never welcome, where every room held painful memories. Then one day, you move into your own place, somewhere beautiful, somewhere safe, somewhere entirely yours. Would you spend your time and energy plotting revenge against the old landlord? Or would you pour that energy into making your new home everything you'd dreamed of? Eleanor chose the latter. She didn't waste precious moments of her new life dwelling on Margaret's cruelty. She didn't let Margaret occupy rent-free space in her mind. The silence between them wasn't passive. It was the most active choice she could make. It said, "You no longer matter enough to hate." That hits differently than any confrontation ever could. Let me share something personal that might resonate with you. I had a relationship, familial actually, where I was consistently undervalued and mistreated. For years, I fantasized about the moment I'd finally tell this person off, the speech I'd deliver, the truth bombs I'd drop. Then something shifted. I realized that confrontation would give them exactly what they'd always taken. My emotional energy, my mental real estate, my power. So instead, I did what Eleanor did. I simply left. No dramatic exit, no scathing letter, no final showdown. Just quiet, permanent distance. And you know what? That person hated it more than any confrontation because they couldn't argue with absence. They couldn't defend themselves against silence. Eleanor understood this instinctively. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And indifference is where true freedom lives. But there was one final encounter, a moment of revelation that encapsulated everything. Several months after Eleanor's engagement, Lady Margaret attended a society function where Eleanor was present. Margaret approached with her practiced smile, attempting casual conversation as if years of abuse were just water under the bridge. "Eleanor, darling, you look wonderful," she said, her voice carrying that familiar manipulation disguised as warmth. The room watched, hungry for drama. Would Eleanor explode? Would she publicly shame Margaret? Instead, Eleanor looked at her aunt with something that resembled pity more than anger and said simply, "Lady Margaret." Just that, a formal acknowledgement devoid of warmth or hostility. Then she turned back to her conversation with Duke Alexander, effectively dismissing Margaret as if she were nothing. The enigma of it stunned everyone watching, especially Margaret, who'd expected either reconciliation or confrontation, never this cool indifference. Here's why Eleanor's approach was so devastating. People who've diminished you hate when you succeed and don't look back. Margaret could have handled anger. Anger meant Eleanor still cared, still needed something from her, still was emotionally entangled. But indifference? That communicates something far more final. You were an obstacle I've moved past, a chapter I've closed, a presence that no longer impacts my life. For someone like Margaret, who'd maintained control through emotional manipulation, losing that power was the ultimate defeat. She'd spent years making Eleanor feel small, and Eleanor's response was to simply outgrow her. Not through spite, but through genuine evolution. Margaret had become a vestiges of a painful past, acknowledged but not dwelled upon, remembered but not empowered. There's a crucial distinction here between forgiveness and reconciliation that I need you to understand, because our culture conflates them constantly. Forgiveness, when and if it comes, is about releasing your own burden, not absolving someone else's guilt. Reconciliation, however, requires repentance, changed behavior, earned trust. Eleanor might eventually forgive Margaret for her own peace, but reconciliation? That ship had sailed. Margaret never acknowledged her cruelty, never apologized, never changed. She only regretted losing access to Eleanor's newfound status. That's not someone you reconcile with. That's someone you protect yourself from. Eleanor's boundaries weren't punishment. They were self-preservation. She wasn't keeping Margaret out as revenge. She was keeping herself safe, whole, protected from further harm. The conspiracy of silence that had protected Margaret for years began crumbling without Eleanor lifting a finger. Other relatives started asking questions. Why was Eleanor treated as a servant? Did you really make your own niece sleep in the staff quarters? Margaret's carefully constructed reputation deteriorated naturally as the truth emerged. Some families cut ties with her, shocked by the revelations. Beatrice and Constance, unmarried and increasingly bitter, became known for their jealous natures rather than their supposed charms. Eleanor didn't orchestrate any of this. She simply stopped protecting Margaret's secrets through her own silence. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always require a judge or jury. Sometimes it's simply the natural consequence of truth finally being known. And Eleanor? She was busy building something beautiful, something forbidden to her for so long. A life defined by love, respect, and genuine belonging. So here we are, at the end of Eleanor's journey. But really, this is where your journey begins. Everything you've just heard, every lesson hidden in her story, every revelation about resilience, boundaries, and self-worth, none of it matters if it stays theoretical. Knowledge without application is just entertainment, and I know you're here for more than that. So let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. What are you tolerating right now that's slowly killing your spirit? Who in your life is treating you like Eleanor was treated? And why are you still giving them access to your energy, your time, your peace? These aren't rhetorical questions. I genuinely want you to think about them, feel them, answer them honestly even if it hurts. Here's the thing about Eleanor's story that should shake you awake. She didn't wait for perfect circumstances to change her life. She didn't wait until she felt ready, or confident, or healed. She made one decision: to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. And that single choice opened doors she didn't even know existed. What's your one decision? What's the boundary you need to set today, not tomorrow, not when things get worse, but right now? Maybe it's that family member who constantly diminishes you, Maybe it's that relationship where you're always giving and never receiving. Maybe it's that job where your contributions go unrecognized. Maybe it's even that voice in your own head that sounds suspiciously like someone who once told you that you weren't enough. Whatever it is, I'm asking you, actually, I'm challenging you to do something about it this week. Let's get practical because inspiration without action is just procrastination with better feelings. Here's your assignment, and yes, I'm serious about this. Identify one person or situation in your life where you're playing small, where you're accepting treatment that contradicts your worth. Write it down. Don't just think it. Write it. Then decide on one concrete boundary you're going to establish. Not a vague, I'll stand up for myself more. I mean specific. I will no longer attend family gatherings where I'm disrespected. I will stop responding to messages from people who only contact me when they need something. I will speak up in meetings instead of letting others take credit for my ideas. Small, clear, actionable. Eleanor didn't transform overnight, and neither will you. But transformation starts with one honest decision, followed by one brave action. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but my situation is different. You don't understand how complicated it is. You're right. I don't know your specific complications, but I know this. Complexity is often just fear wearing a disguise. Eleanor's situation was complicated too. She had no money, no other family, nowhere to go. She could have listed 1,000 reasons why changing her circumstances was impossible. But she did it anyway, not because it was easy or guaranteed, but because staying was slowly erasing her. What's your excuse really protecting you from failure or the terrifying possibility of success? What would your life look like 6 months from now if you stopped accepting the unacceptable today? Can you see it? That version of you who walks into rooms with confidence, who sets boundaries without guilt, who chooses peace over people-pleasing, that person already exists inside you. They're just waiting for you to make space for them. Here's something Eleanor understood that I need you to grasp. The people who benefit from your silence will be furious when you find your voice. Lady Margaret didn't suddenly become supportive when Eleanor's circumstances changed. She became more desperate, more manipulative, more threatened. When you start establishing boundaries and reclaiming your worth, expect resistance. Expect people to call you selfish, difficult, changed, good. Let them. Their discomfort with your growth is not your responsibility to manage. Your responsibility is to yourself, to that part of you that's been waiting patiently, sometimes not so patiently, for you to finally choose yourself. Are you going to keep betraying yourself to keep others comfortable? Or are you ready to experience the liberation that comes from unapologetic authenticity? Let me leave you with this final thought, and I want you to really sit with it. Eleanor's story isn't special because she was exceptional. It's powerful because she was ordinary. She wasn't born with superpowers or secret advantages. She was just a woman who refused to let her circumstances define her character, who maintained her humanity in dehumanizing situations, who believed in her worth even when no one else did. If she could do that while serving champagne to people who treated her like furniture, what can you do with the resources and freedom you have right now? The answer should terrify and excite you in equal measure. Your transformation isn't waiting for perfect conditions. It's waiting for your decision. So what's it going to be? Are you going to stay comfortable in your misery, or are you ready to get uncomfortable in your growth? If Eleanor's journey resonated with you, if something in her story touched that place inside you that knows you're meant for more, then I need you to do something for me. Actually, for yourself. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because this is just the beginning. We're going to keep exploring these stories, these lessons, these uncomfortable truths that most people are too scared to talk about. We're building a community of people who refuse to settle, who choose growth over comfort, who understand that your past doesn't determine your future unless you let it. Eleanor's story is over, but yours is still being written. Make sure the next chapter is worth reading. I'll see you in the next one. Now go set that boundary.